Hello, and welcome to Two Pews in a Pod. Join us as we explore faith in a modern world at Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Now, here is your host, Pastor Paul Baglios.
I'm Paul Baglios.
And I'm Megan Wyatt.
And both of us are happy to welcome all of you who may be watching or listening to this podcast to the first of what we are intending to be 6 episodes under the series theme or title, Difficult Questions We've Been Asked. And in each case, the 6 episodes that we have in mind will each deal with a different question. These are questions that people at Evangelical Lutheran Church have asked, either one or both of us, questions that have no quick, fixed answer, but invite deeper consideration and reflection. And our purpose in the 6 episodes we're intending for this series is not so much to try to provide an answer to these difficult questions, but to converse together about the questions in a way that can model, for those of you listening or watching, how to think with Scripture. Neither Megan nor I wants to tell anyone what they should think about these questions or others, but we're hoping to give an example of, again, how to think, and specifically how to think with Scripture. With that said, why don't you tell us about this first question for episode 1?
Absolutely. So the question that we are going to be grappling with today is, how do you live a holy life in a difficult world? And this question has come up in several conversations with our congregation members, feeling the weight of the world. How do they continue to read the news and stay active and involved, and also be hopeful and remain steadfast in their faith and that rooted in holiness? How do they see that holiness when things are really difficult? And I think it's very timely of a question for us to be talking about. But it's one that doesn't have, actually, it's a question that has really great canned answers that we could give, which is, there's a plan, right? God has a plan for everything, and just hold on to your faith, and God's footsteps are walking beside you. All of those things we kind of allude to, which are beautiful and comforting, but not necessarily helpful on when it comes to evolving our faith as well, and us grappling with a personal understanding of what that means when things are really difficult.
Well, and we want, as we consider each of these questions, to provide an example of, again, how to think with Scripture. We'll be suggesting some framing texts. These may not frame your thinking about the questions that we're talking about, but they frame ours. And you and I have spoken about this.
Yes.
So with regard to this first question, what is a passage of Scripture that helps you think about the question and live into it?
Sure. I think Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, when we were looking into this episode and how we wanted to respond and give a framework, I really appreciate the invitation within that from Jesus, that we are to rest. Right? It's a passage where we are bringing our weariness and acknowledging that. We're not hiding from the weariness or saying, don't be tired, don't be sad, don't be scared. That sense of being weary is in fact holy within that.
It's very important, I think, to stress that, because there can be, I've heard of understandings that if you have faith, then you're always just feeling cheerful and chipper no matter what.
Yeah.
That's not true.
Right.
And clearly for the people of Scripture, that's not true. And Jesus does address those of his followers who are feeling the weariness.
Right. And I think that's part of it too. It's framing it as leaning on Jesus, who is also weary. So we are not alone in this. And I think that is part of the thing that can be really freeing, is within scripture all the times that we know that God is weary with us and is not completely, ignorant to our stress and our fears and how tired we are, but knowing that we can find rest in and with God. And so really Matthew 11 feels to me like that invitation to rest, as to find rest and the holiness of resting.
And companionship.
Yes.
I think one of the things that can so badly depress any effort to live a holy life, by which we mean a life accompanying Jesus, a life that walks with Jesus, is that involves living a certain way in a world that most of the time lives very different ways.
Yes.
Very different values, convictions, very different behaviors, very different sense of what is both accepted and expected.
Yeah.
And it can seem lonely to try with integrity to lead a Christian life when so much of the world that we inhabit doesn't care about that.
Yeah, or doesn't seem to.
Or
Right.
cares about it in different ways.
Right. And there's this thing that we have to continue carrying the worry. We don't just put it aside and cast away, because I think that's something that we are tempted to do, is to say, oh, this is just too hard and too much, so I'm going to shut it down, shut it out, and put it away so I don't have to think about that. And we see within scripture over and over again, and then within Psalms, and that is not what we are supposed to do. We are supposed to be people who can see and walk in the tension of both of those things, right? That life and the world is hard and broken, but we are people of truth and hope.
And I think, to come back to what you were saying about rest, I think that our faith does provide us the grace of rest and refuge. But it's not escape.
Yeah.
It doesn't transport us out of this world or its troubles, its struggles, its pains, its griefs into some other fantasy realm. It doesn't anesthetize us, or shouldn't. I have sometimes heard religious people speak of their faith in a way that sounds almost like they are taking a drug that numbs them.
Yes.
As I was thinking about framing texts, that my thought around this question would want to reflect, I think of Jesus saying, "Follow me." When we talk about faithful living, holy living, as Christian people, we're talking about answering Jesus' invitation to follow him, to come with me. And it's important to remember, he walks the way of the cross.
Yes.
I think of, I'm dating myself, I know, although many people will have seen this, the film version, The Sound of Music. And when Julie Andrews, now hired to be nanny to the children, takes them off on a picnic, and they're skipping and singing and hiking through the beautiful hills of the Alps. Jesus' call to follow me takes us in a very different place.
Yes.
He calls us to follow him, to come against, to come beside, to come into empathy and compassion for all of the world's suffering and pain.
Right.
And that certainly includes our own. We bring our pain into our engagement with the world's pain.
Yeah.
Christian faith is about truth-telling. We don't invent more pleasant realities than the ones we inhabit, but rather we seek to live faithfully in the realities we inhabit. And Jesus says, this will be the way of the cross.
Right.
It will involve, in order to heal life, to lift life, to embrace life, we must also, in a sense, lose life and be willing to endure the wounds.
Yeah, and I was just thinking throughout that what comes to my mind, and just being from Easter, and maybe you had a sermon recently where we talked about taking up our cross, right? As often as is something that people say, well, it's my cross to bear, and it turns into not something that's not always a healthy thing. And really, it's not taking up suffering just to suffer, right? As much as it is to join with Christ in the work for justice, in the work for others and compassion, and for what's good with God's kingdom. And I think that's the difficulty of compassion and empathy, which are the most beautiful parts to me about humanity, is that, and I was thinking of 2 Corinthians within this one, the jars of clay, that we are weak and brittle. And that weakness and that brittleness comes from our empathy and our compassion. And it could easily be seen as something that breaks us. But in fact, it is our biggest strength. And it's the biggest doorway that we have to spirit and through Christ is our weakness. And I absolutely lean on that. When I'm feeling scared and weak and full of questions, I lean on that passage of remembering, well, this is what I am. I'm a human, and this is my design, is to be this. And so there's nothing wrong with it. But I can be strong.
Clay jars can be cracked and chipped.
Ground up.
Yep. And yet, I believe without question that the person who feels no pain neither can ever touch pain.
Yeah.
The person who carries no wound neither can carry empathy for the wounded.
Yes.
And to say that life, faithful living, holy living, is following Jesus in the way of the cross, that means following the one who receives wounds from the wounding world in order to heal the wounded world.
Yeah.
And there are many times that that's going to be scary, wearying, frightening, painful. But where we began when you spoke about framing passages from Matthew, the same Lord who invites us to follow him in the way of the cross assures us that my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And we come into the rest that you were talking about, not by stepping aside or taking a pause from walking with Jesus, but by walking further, by walking closer, by walking longer.
Absolutely.
We begin to experience that hard way of the cross is, in a sense, ironically, refreshing and light and life-giving. And it's difficult to explain that. I think it can only be experienced, but we may know analogies. I know that you are a dedicated runner.
Yes.
And I have often heard of people talk about runner's high. You know, that if you begin a run on any given day, or you start a discipline of running, at first it's really hard and it's really painful. And you're tired and you're weary and you're discouraged.
Yes.
But if you keep at it, you begin to have this experience that you run through it to a kind of physical elation.
Yes.
Not being a runner myself, I've only ever heard about this. But it makes a kind of sense to me.
And something that I know, and it's similar to, honestly, like really to my faith, because you know that running is a time that I often think for myself. But when I am in those first mile and a half or 2 miles where I'm getting tired and I'm just going, I don't want to do this, the best thing for me to do is really frame it as, I can't believe I'm this strong. I can't believe that I can run 1 more mile, or I'm actually feeling really good. Like I have to talk myself up. And a part of that is that it's not saying that it doesn't hurt or that the world isn't exhausting, but to also rejoice in the fact that we have life and we have other people to share in these things. And that's kind of that framework of it really is an internal work. And it's why we can't give a direct answer to these questions, right? Because it is it is a discipline and a practice to be working with your own mental health and headspace throughout it, and knowing when you need to share with other people and when you're feeling alone in carrying things. That's why it feels so good and why support groups are so important, so that when things feel weary, and that's something that we keep seeing lately happen, is we have people who are coming with weariness for this difficult world, and they're saying, can we form a support group? Or is there a way that we can connect with other people who are going through these things? It's the podcast series we had on losing a spouse. And afterwards, that's some of the conversation I picked up on, how nice it was to just be able to connect with other people who went through or are continuing to go through something really hard.
I'm agreeing.
Yeah.
A thought, as I listened to you, began to take shape, and I'm trying to see if I can give birth to it, or if I'll just have to spend 40 seconds in mumbling gibberish. But again, when Jesus says, follow me, take up your cross, and my burden is easy, how can those things be true? We can be completely wearied by the pains and the discouragements that we bear within us and do nothing except let that weariness finally crush us. We can be completely weary and discouraged about the pains and the ordeals of the world and do nothing and just be entirely overwhelmed.
Right.
And sink into despair.
Or shut ourselves away from. Yeah.
And ironically, Jesus' call to walk with him more deeply into and more closer beside other hurting people, more deeply into the world's suffering and trauma. I think that very movement, that very approach, however haltingly and however timidly we may make it, seeking to live faithfully or wholly with Jesus, to get closer to those ordeals and those wounds is also and already an act of healing.
I was going to say, it can be so freeing.
Yep.
That we don't name it.
We're not resolving our own pain or anybody else's pain, but there's a way in which seeing it, being willing to acknowledge it, to hold it for ourselves, to help hold it for others, it may not lift it all away from us, but at least we're putting spiritual hands under the burden. And we begin to feel that the burden is lightening.
When it's that idea of that, to me, it's that abiding presence, right? That throughout it all, we are never alone. And we have a God who experienced that and didn't turn from it. And by all means, being God could have, right? I always think of that, of Jesus on the cross, like, you didn't have to do this, but did and faced it head on. And so to me, that always is, God understands.
I think of Jesus before the cross in Gethsemane.
Yeah.
Kind of there were many, many moments of decision for Jesus, but that clearly was one of the most acute moments of decision. Am I really going to do this?
Yeah.
Am I really going to stand up from my posture of kneeling prayer in this place and now be arrested? Or can I slip away? And that was a real possibility. Absolutely. And I think we need to read Scripture and acknowledge this. And that's one of my issues when people use platitudes about, it's all God's plan.
Yes.
I think there's a serious difference between a confidence in God's promise and the sort of illusion about God's plan, which would seem to suggest to me that our lives and our world simply roll along in a kind of mechanical process.
Passive bystanders in this. And I think that's something that we have fallen into and easily fall into, because it allows us to then only focus on ourselves and our little bubble, which is, again, what we are not called to be again and again. But the promise is what we hang on to, along with, like you said, the companionship of knowing that there are beautiful, holy things that happen in the walk that we take, in the weary days. I think is sometimes when the most holy, my holy experiences as an ordained minister have often been on really hard days, hard conversations, when we're exhausted, when we are grief counseling, I think is often when I feel that the burden is light.
Is light. We hope that this has been perhaps inspiring, instructive, at least interesting for you if you've listened or watched. So to wrap this up, how to live a holy life in a very broken world, especially when we know that we ourselves are broken people. Thinking with Scripture, I'm summarizing here, helps us to understand that we bring our own brokenness to that question, and that holy living involves, by the invitation and the encouragement of Jesus, stepping closer to it, moving more deeply into it, acknowledging, not taking recourse or retreat behind illusion or fantasy.
Absolutely.
And then finding, I love the way that you said it, our very weakness can be a vessel of extraordinary strength.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah,
this is
you're
fun.
So welcome.
I'm Paul Baglios.
And I'm Megan Wyant. Thank you for joining us today.
This has been Two Pews in a Pod, a podcast hosted by the pastor of Evangelical Lutheran Church in Frederick, Maryland. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.